Please note that this episode contains discussions of violence and suicide. If you or anyone you know is struggling with thoughts of suicide, you can call or text 988 to get instant and free crisis support in the United States. Additional resources will also be provided in our episode show notes. Hi there. I'm Abby Schomer, co-founder of Rep Science and host of the Marginal Podcast, which gives voice to the socially marginalized founders and startup contributors you've likely not heard from yet. On today's episode, I sit down with my co-founder, Brian Krebs, who was a huge source of inspiration in creating this podcast. In addition to being a serial founder of 25 years, Brian identifies as formerly incarcerated and unhoused. Brian is also a Korean adoptee and has spent a considerable amount of time as a student, mentor, mental health patient, and mental health advocate. For reasons you'll soon understand, we couldn't distill Brian's story into just one episode. So, today's episode is one of two installments where we'll dive deep on Brian's backstory, up through the completion of his adult prison sentence. Be sure to listen to our next episode to learn about Brian's life and entrepreneurial pursuits following his release from prison. And with that, I'm excited to share Brian's story with you all today. Okay, Brian. So I want to start with actually how I first met you and what my first impressions are when I first met you.
I love it.
Brian and I worked at a startup together before starting the company we have now. And I remember the first time I interviewed with Brian, I got on a virtual Zoom call with him. And he had this very impressive audio setup. If for those who are watching on YouTube, you'll see it now. He had this podcast mic and this arm, this stand. And I was incredibly intimidated. I was like, oh, I'm playing with the big leagues. Because I was using my MacBook. And I was like, this is a true professional. So that was my first impression of you. I was like, this is somebody who does like audio tours. He's kind of like doing the rounds. So that was
Little
my
did you
first
know.
impression. I know. And then I believe a couple weeks after that first interview, I kind of knew at that point that I was going to be extended an offer by your company. And I was just doing some of my own research and I was listening to podcasts and I found one that you were on. And it was a very industry specific podcast. At the time, we were both working in kind of this mobile developer ecosystem. And you were on a podcast talking about your product at the time, but in that podcast, it was also the first time that you had actually spoke openly about your journey with incarceration and being unhoused. And I remember listening to that podcast. And at the time, I was pretty sold on joining this company. But after I heard that podcast, the deal was done for me. I was like, this is somebody I need to work for. I guess maybe you are just as impressive as my first impressions, like, because that podcast was great. But yeah, it's so funny how podcasting characterized a lot of our first interactions together.
I love it. Yeah, I didn't realize that it's a weird timing, really, because I had really kept those two worlds totally separate until then. My background, my history, my childhood, and my working life, they were wholly separate. So I kind of just grew some courage, I guess, and started talking about it on that very podcast. So it's really weird how the timing worked out. You were able to hear that just before you came on board.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to understand why that podcast, why at that moment in time did you decide to kind of come forth with some of this information around your background?
So I have to give at least some credit to Tommy. He's just a really good dude, and I felt comfortable sharing some of those things. Also, it coincided with a time in my life where I started realizing that the reasons that I had kept those two worlds separate up until that point was really just fear. Those two worlds aren't really separate. Honestly, we're just humans, whether we're in the role of a kind of a worker or employee at a company, or we're just walking around with our friends. And no doubt about it, like there are other factors involved when you're at work in terms of professionality and things like that. But at the end of the day, I share my story with people I know in my personal life for a pretty specific reason, just to maybe hopefully reach out and touch someone that, you know, struggled through similar things and make them feel like they're not alone like I felt for so long. And really, it's very much the same thing in a working environment where just because you are at a company and in the role of an employee at the moment doesn't mean you haven't had struggles maybe similar to mine. So I just realized that pulling that wall down that was built pretty arbitrarily just made sense to achieve the same goals I'm always trying to achieve.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense, and I think, too, you were with someone who made you feel safe, and I think that's so big. You need to feel kinda psychologically safe or feel like you can trust the person with that information, all the while, actually, you were trusting countless people with that information because a lot of people beyond Tommy listen to that podcast, but I think it really goes a long way. Did you have any reservations going into that discussion? Was there anything that you chose to not disclose or you were hesitant to disclose for whatever reason?
Not really, although I will say that there are, and I don't know why, I think it's actually because of responses I've gotten in the past. Definitely, I just generally have historically felt more comfortable disclosing things about how I sold drugs and was incarcerated, things like that. Sometimes those things, oddly, it depends on the person you're talking to, but sometimes those things can actually even be like glorified in a way, in
Mhm.
almost a sort of really strange way by some people. Like, "Oh, that's really interesting. That's really cool." You know, you don't always get that. Sometimes you do get this weird glorification. So maybe because of those responses, I've been conditioned a little bit to be a bit more open about those things. Whereas, and they're so intertwined, but at the same time period of my life, my struggles with mental health and suicide attempts and things like that, I do tend to just generally have a bit more fear around sharing. And while maybe it wasn't top of mind consciously, you'll probably remember I did not talk about what really could be considered like the root cause of those symptoms, which is my struggles with mental health. So yeah, I suppose maybe not top of mind consciously, but I probably do have some bias between the subjects I'm more comfortable about talking about and the ones I'm not.
Yeah. I mean, I've even noticed that with our relationship. I mean, I've known you now for a couple years, and I didn't know till much more recently about the mental health component of your history. And I can understand why. And I completely resonate with what you're saying about how some of these elements can be glorified too, especially when you're in startup culture. We've talked about this before, like being a drug dealer is a business. You are a business operator. And especially with the release of shows like Breaking Bad and things like that, there is kind of this romanticizing of that whole system sometimes, depending on who you
Yeah.
talk to. So
Yeah.
I can completely understand and acknowledge why you may have parsed those things. But I'd love to, at this point, I'd actually love to get to the crux of where that started. What was the inception point of a lot of these struggles going, dating back to your early childhood? So if you're okay with that, I'd love to start from the very, very, very beginning of Brian Krebs.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, and it is the very beginning in my particular case, and others too, found themselves in my situation. So I was an orphan. I was orphaned at a very young age. I don't know much about my history, but I was, in very, very early in my life, within days, probably weeks at most, I was relinquished to an orphanage, probably, and spent some time there, about 3 months before I was adopted by a white couple who were having trouble conceiving themselves, in Baltimore, Maryland. So I was born in Busan, Korea, and I was adopted as really an infant at 3 months old to this white couple in the U.S. So that shaped drastically shaped my life in my childhood for sure, and to this day, no doubt about it. The trauma of the loss of my mother, especially, for some reason, I fixated on her, my birth mother, but my both of my parents, of course, biological parents, paved the way for what in myself turned out to be manifested as anger. And it doesn't have to be. I've now met many, many intracountry adoptees. Sometimes it manifests in anger. It doesn't have to, but for me, it definitely did. Anger, fear, there, I think those emotions are pretty closely intertwined often. And for me, growing up as a really young child, I was very violent. I was prone to fits of like big emotions, and I started getting in lots of trouble at a very young age. My earliest memories start around second grade, and I remember getting thrown out of class a lot, already being put on these very specific programs for problem students. So that only caused the spiral further, just another reinforcement of how I was different and warranted extra eyeballs on me, essentially. And that kind of led to a lot of violent outbursts starting probably around the same age in those, very young elementary school years, and getting in fights and things like that. And that kind of culminated in my adoptive parents just kind of not knowing what to do and eventually throwing me out when I was 15.
Can I ask, what does that look like to have your parents throw you out at 15? What does that even look like?
The weird thing is, and this is something that I've realized much later in life, is that a lot of people have trouble empathizing with the fact that I never really bonded with my adoptive parents. They're the only parents I ever knew, but I didn't never really had any sort of bond with them, which is usually just taken for granted between a child and their parents. For example, and this may ruffle some feathers, and I don't mean anything negative by it, but when they died, I didn't have the sort of reaction that a lot of people would just imagine is the normal reaction to your parents dying. At that time, at that kind of early age, while I did not have that bond, that kind of normal bond, if you will, with them, it still stung deeply every time I felt abandoned by them. The abandonment of being thrown out on the streets at 15 is certainly abandonment, but or it felt like abandonment to me,
Mhm.
but it wasn't the first time, because 15 is pretty late in terms of my mental health struggles. So by that time, they had already thrown me into various mental health facilities for juveniles for long stretches and quite a number of times. And each time it happened, I just felt kind of abandoned again. I it just felt like the next logical step. I was on my own often. I felt like I was really always on my own. So when they threw me out for having drugs in their house, I was selling drugs at the time. So, they were just kind of protecting themselves legally, to be honest. I didn't feel any particular sadness. It was just the only difference was I had to go live on the streets. And that was a big change for sure. But that's a change for anyone that finds themselves unhoused.
Completely. I can understand how, like you said, this was kind of one in a series of events where you felt like you were being abandoned or your parents were kind of turning your back on you. But even earlier than that, you were kind of abandoned as an infant too. It's so unfortunate that this was such a recurring theme in your life. I think at the same time, you've built resilience because it's happened so many times, but how unfortunate for that to happen to a child. At 15, you're so used to being abandoned, right? And the reason I ask is, much like you said, people can't empathize with your situation, not mourning the loss of your adoptive parents. I can't empathize with that because I have a great relationship with my parents. And I remember one of your parents died right after I joined your company. And I didn't know all of this context, and I think it makes a lot of sense the way you're explaining it now. I'd love to understand a little bit about, okay, so you were kicked out and you kind of almost went willingly, it sounds like, right?
Yeah. Yeah, basically, didn't make a big difference to me. I mean, don't get me wrong, like, before then, I had never been unhoused, so that was
Yeah.
a big change and, a negative one, for sure.
Mhm.
My life was weird after that. I was in high school, your early years of high school, and I, eventually but after a pretty short time, really, a matter of weeks, I ended up finding my best friend at the time, who's unfortunately dead now.
I'm
He
sorry.
let me sleep in his truck. So I had a place to sleep. I was still going to high school periodically. I had never really been a consistent attendee of school. So, and this didn't help my attendance for sure, but I did still go periodically. In fact, with him, he was a little bit older than me. He was driving. Obviously, I was sleeping in his truck, so he'd drive us both to school. Sometimes he went to school much more than me. He graduated. He was almost like a good influence on me. He actually maybe increased my attendance rate while I was unhoused. But I'd leave a lot. Like it just wasn't my thing. I didn't want to be there really, and I'd have a lot of violent outbursts there as well.
Yeah.
Police called on me many times. I was pretty well known at this school for just being a kind of a troublemaker, but I didn't last too much longer. I did drop out. It's pretty tough going to high school and doing those things when you're number one not interested in the first place, but number two you don't have a place to sleep. So I did leave. It was just a social location for me anyway, really
Mhm.
at that point, and I just kind of did what I wanted really. And one day I did finally drop out, but that really freed up a lot of time for me to get myself off the streets. So I kind of ramped up my drug dealing
Right.
really and built a real business out of it. And it became no longer a hobby, but a means to an end. So I took it much more seriously to get myself off the streets, really. And shortly thereafter, I was able to start living in motels, really, really crappy hotels in the Baltimore area that didn't mind renting a room to a kid, basically.
Wow, yeah.
Those are
It's a
not the good
minor.
ones, let me tell you.
Yeah.
And a close friend not too long after that was murdered in one of those actually. So they're not nice places for sure, but I was off the streets and I was by that point in my life, I was actually enjoying the freedom and the independence. I'd always been a very independent person and I didn't mind my bar wasn't high. I didn't need like turn down service. Just being able to run my little business, which I really, really enjoyed. So many different things about it. The money was great, but it also came with a lot of clout and even power later on. Not at that age, but later, there was a lot of reasons to like it for me, kind of based on the human I was back then, and obviously just staying off the streets and being able to eat regular meals.
I think this is so interesting because I think people assume that staying the course and staying in school is the best pathway to economic freedom, right? If you stay in school, that is gonna afford you more resources, that is gonna keep you safer. But I think that is only true within certain contexts. That is only true if you have parents whose roofs you're living under and they're feeding you. But if you don't, then going to school and I mean, now I mean, I don't know at the time when I was going to high school, I had to pay for lunch, so meals weren't free. So, if you don't have those means and those resources at home, then school can actually be something that is a barrier to you being able to exercise your own economic freedom and kind of accrue capital because you're spending all your
Yeah.
time in a classroom.
Yep, and it's a much longer term play there. Long run, it's better, but you have to deal with your hierarchy of needs kind of from the
Exactly.
bottom up. So, yeah, I knew kids that in that Baltimore area that didn't have electricity a lot of the time. I don't know how they were expected to excel in school. It really does depend on your situation. I completely agree.
That's such an interesting paradox. I'm so glad we touched on it. tell me a little bit more because now, for all intents and purposes, we're getting into your entrepreneurial story. So tell me a little
Yeah.
bit more about, operating this business because it was probably your first business.
My first little business was actually loan sharking. I found that scraping together some money, even change, would buy like small cookies or whatever. And some kids, in fact, a lot of kids didn't have the money, but they wanted a cookie. I'd lend them like a quarter or 50 cents or whatever to buy the cookie and then just charge them interest essentially. I didn't know what that was or that was actually a legitimate business model out in the world. But yeah, I know language for it, but I just found that it worked and I was making money that way. And soon after that, I had an idea because it was a small school and there was only one woodshop class. There was a system whereby kids would rotate in and out of it throughout the year. So I just realized that after kids have do their final woodworking project and rotate out, that project was collecting dust or it was really just tossed in the trash or whatever.
Mhm.
So I'd basically give them a little money for it and then possess it and then actually like create these hand drawn catalogs of the projects that I had for sale and I'd sell them to the next kids rotating into the class so they didn't have to do a project. And these overworked, underpaid teachers, they didn't even realize they were grading the same projects over and over again. So I that actually became a much more lucrative business than the loan sharking business, but it also created a black market for these projects where kids were being robbed for their projects. One kid would sell me like 5 or 6 different projects at once. And I'm thinking like, where are you getting these projects? Well, he was going around robbing kids. So that was bringing a lot of
Mm.
heat onto me. So I shut the whole thing down. But in the end, it was actually quite lucrative. And that was the the moment when I realized I really, really enjoyed this. Not only could it, you know, change my life financially, but also it was just I had a knack for it and I just really, really enjoyed doing it. I didn't enjoy the classes. So during a class when a teacher was trying to teach me math or something that I could actually probably use in the future, I was there like sketching these hand drawn catalogs of my inventory and dropping them into people's lockers. So that was my first foray into quote unquote business, I guess you could say. And after that, I guess I don't know why, but I just knew that I could sell drugs, and I found an opportunity, and I started selling drugs to just have money. Really,
Okay, so this was
once my
before, right, this was before your parents kicked you out. Okay.
That's right. That's right. Yep. And my it was my father actually, my adoptive father found drugs in his home. Very devout Christian, did not appreciate that. Threw me out. But that really was the tipping point for me where I was like, okay, this is I kind of have to do this now full time. Not right away, but I realized this eventually when I kind of felt the sting of being unhoused, really. And from then on, that's what I did for quite a few years, actually, dodging police and other law enforcement, and all culminating eventually in my first ever time being arrested as an adult. Shortly after my 18th birthday, I was actually just turned 19, in fact, and being locked up for the first time as an adult.
As an adult. So you had been locked up previously as a minor?
Yes. Yeah, all those mental health struggles, the violent outbursts, the suicide attempts, that gets you locked up pretty quick as a minor. And these juvenile mental health facilities, they not all, I'm sure, but at least in my experience in Baltimore, they masquerade as mental health facilities. They call themselves mental health facilities, and your parents believe they're
Right.
mental health facilities,
Mhm.
but they're not. No one is there to help you. If anything, the adults there are there to take out their anger on you. So kids are getting beat up every day. there probably was more adult to child violence there than child to child violence. There's plenty of the latter as well. But yeah, it's pretty horrific. Some of those facilities have been shut down since. I got a little random check in the mail when I was in my probably mid 20s from a class action lawsuit that I certainly wasn't expecting. But yeah, a lot of those are now shut down. I'm happy to say. I'm guessing maybe there are some still in operation, I would imagine, but I spent a good amount of time in and out of those in my younger years for sure.
That's crazy. I mean, you hear about some of those camps, and I mean, celebrities have been big whistleblowers here. Those camps that parents send their children to, and they're basically parents think that they're behavioral corrective facilities, but they're just super predatory and awful. So, yeah, I mean, those things still happen, and I can empathize with certain parents too, because if they don't have all the information and they think this is going to turn around their child's future and give them opportunity, I mean, at that point, I can't blame them for making that choice given all the information they had. If they were equipped with information that might not be at all representative of what's going on in those facilities.
For sure. Yeah, it's hard to blame the parents in this case. For the most part, once you reach that point, you're pretty much at wit's end. You just don't know what to
Yeah.
do.
Yeah, you're
It's the same
desperate.
reason my parents threw me out,
Yeah.
right? They just didn't know what to do. I now know what I would do should I ever become a parent, but it's tough. It really is tough. And my parents had just very few resources. The only thing I blame them for at all is their almost wholly uncurious nature about adoption.
Got it. And this is going back a little bit, but you just made me think of it. Were there any when you were growing up with white parents, was there any attempt to introduce elements of your Korean culture and kind of educate you around where you came from? Or was that not really something that was discussed?
There was a very brief attempt and I shot it down immediately. Thing is, I think that type of thing is incredibly important. I'm pretty much fully against intercountry adoption, but I will say that in the cases where it does happen still, introducing a child to their birth culture, I think is incredibly important, but it has to happen pretty naturally and at a young age. And it has to be introduced and maintained as something really, really positive. And it takes a lot of effort. And my adoptive parents just didn't put forth that effort. By the time they tried to introduce me to my birth culture at this sort of Korean culture festival sort of thing, I was already like a teenager. I was against standing out at all, really, I will say. I absolutely harbored an incredible amount of self-hatred for my own Asianness. If I could have changed one thing about myself, I would have made myself white at that age. And because of that, I rejected my birth culture so swiftly and with such aggressiveness that they never really tried again. I hated myself for being Asian by that point, and there was really nothing they could have done by then, to change that. I had to accept my own Asianness and love my own Asianness on my own after that, and it happened much, much later, literally into my late 20s.
Got it. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. All right, so that was a bit of a derailment, but I think it was really important to speak to that, and I know it will probably come up in subsequent topics, but back to you being locked up as an adult, right? Because for all intents and purposes, you were as a child, as a minor in these behavioral facilities, but or these mental health facilities, but as an adult, you were put in adult prison. Walk me through that experience. What was it like?
That was definitely different than being a child in these mental health facilities for sure. I was in there for a short time, less than a year,
Okay.
not much less, but less than a year. When you're locked up for less than a year in Maryland, at the very least, and you're not in on a federal charge, you end up in a very, very low grade sort of facility. The interesting thing is I knew a lot of people there, and a lot of them were either just coming back from or on their way to, a, like, state prison where you're there for a much longer period. So you're definitely there with murderers and stuff like that, but a lot of people there have something to lose. They're not there for life or anything like that. So my experience is going to differ from others' experiences who did like very long bids. And as soon as I went in, I was on work release, first of all. I was actually kicked off of work release because I came back a couple minutes late one day. So
Can you
after
explain sorry, Brian, can you explain what work release is?
Yeah, sorry, absolutely. So work release is a setup that has to be approved by a judge who's sentencing you to essentially you have to get a job. I already had one actually. By this point, I was already working in software development.
Oh, no way. Okay.
I was really a complete mess, but it was a short stint in which I was actually living with my adopted parents again at about 19. I had already dropped out. I was just kind of like I wasn't really doing much, honestly. And I remember my adoptive mother coming to me with an ad circled in the local paper that was this job opportunity in software, and she knew that I had an interest in software, which I had actually developed even while I was out robbing people and committing a lot of like violent crime. At the same time, I was also like messing with programming at night. And my adoptive father was an early adopter of computers because he was in like IT, not a programmer, but he was in IT for a like tractor company, basically. So we had a computer when others didn't, even when I didn't have like a Nintendo and like stuff like that other kids had. We had a computer. So I was programming on this computer from a very young age, actually. I found it really, really fascinating. And I never really told anybody about it, but my adopted parents knew.
Mhm.
And she had circled this ad in the paper and kind of like was like, look, if you want to be here, you have to go get a job. So I went for this interview, not expecting anything. And that's where I met who became a mentor, and I would say even like second father to me, Pete, who was running this software company, a local software company just outside of Baltimore. And he hired me for some reason. I don't know why. I had no actual experience. And I started working for him. He taught me a lot, and I was kind of honing my programming skills in a real world setting. And that's when a lot of things kind of went down. Long story short, someone had slashed my tires in front of my parents' house the night before. And so I had to get a ride into the office that day. I was called by my sister, said that people were trying to break in to our parents' home. Once again, I was selling drugs. I was not supposed to, obviously. It's the reason they kicked me out originally when I was a
Mm.
kid.
Yeah.
So I was still kind of defying their, requests, pretty reasonable requests. My ex at the time, she had this idea in her mind that she knew where I kept everything in my parents' home. So she set up a robbery with four people she knew and had them kind of try to break into my parents' home to basically steal my drugs and money. Um, in the end, they never actually got in, and cops were called by neighbors. And by the time that I heard about it from my sister and managed to get a ride back to my parents' place, the cops were already there. It was too late. I couldn't go into the house at that point, and my father didn't know what was
Yeah.
going on, so he let the police in. And of course, they searched and found a whole bunch of cash and a whole bunch of weed is what I was selling at the time. Thank goodness, because anything else would have had me locked up a lot longer. And that's how I saw them bring out the bags as evidence, and I knew that I was going to get locked up. So I gave my friend my cell phone and a bunch of cash that I had in my pocket, which I later spent on a lawyer, and went on in for many hours of interrogation. And when I didn't give anyone up, they pretty quickly locked me up. My lawyer kind of fought for work release here. It was my first offense as an adult. So I was granted work release, but now I had to tell Pete, this guy I'm working for in software development,
Yeah.
that I was getting locked up. He had no idea what I was doing in my other life. So I'd explain what work release was, which is as soon as you have a job, I already had a job, or you can get a job. A lot of people go into like fast food or whatever. You can actually spend your days at work, but you have to come back to jail at a very specific time. And then you're really just sleeping there and eating breakfast. That's really what it comes down to, and, like, showering, getting ready, obviously, in a totally separate dorm where they're allowing people to have work release. There's no violence happening in this work release dorm. So it was all pretty chill, really, and that was great, honestly. I'd hang out at my office, program all day. I'd see my girlfriend even. She'd meet me there. It was almost like not being locked up at all, but I did come back late one day. They immediately kicked me off of work release, and then I ended up doing hard time for the rest of my bid.
When you had to tell Pete, how did he respond?
Shocked, definitely shocked.
Yeah.
He had no idea, didn't know what work release even was, and I just kind of said, like, "Look, I'll be able to continue working for you if you're okay with this situation," because he had to kind of vouch for me as well. There's some paperwork to work through, so he was fine with it.
Wow.
And then, of course, once I got locked up and started doing hard time, I made sure, through playing a little game of telephone, to get word to him that I wasn't coming back.
Yeah.
And he was not able to get word back to me. But when I got out, he still had a job waiting for me, which is probably the biggest difference between me getting out and many, many other people I know getting out and continuing to really, really struggle.
So when you were then told you couldn't be on work release anymore, you were just locked up day in, day out. You were in prison. You were confined to that space. What was that like?
So it was a dorm setup. It was me and 19 other men all in a single dorm with a day room on one side that opens at a certain hour when breakfast starts. And there's like tables in there where you play cards or throw dice or whatever it is. And then there's where the beds are in the other half and where the one toilet is. I knew people there, luckily, in the dorm that I was sent to. So a lot of it was more just learning the ropes because it's a totally different way of living. And they're pretty specific unwritten rules. The
Yeah.
weakest person doesn't have a bed sheet because you take their bed sheet and that gets wrapped around the toilet in the bedside as a wall essentially so you can use the bathroom in privacy. There's ways to make what we call a hookup, this kind of like soup type of thing, basically cheesy sort of soup that you make out of a handful of ingredients, including ramen noodle packets that are available on commissaries. So a lot of it was just kind of learning the ropes, the unwritten rules, and then just using the people that I already knew there as like my guides basically to show me the ropes. This is the first time I ever been locked up. For them, it wasn't even close to the first time. You kind of tend to grow eyes in the back of your head. There were definitely a good many people in there that my first day after getting kicked off of work release, I saw someone get pretty messed up. And it happened, many times after that. But yeah, I stayed safe the entire time because of the people I knew. But yeah, it can be a strange and unpleasant experience for sure.
Yeah. I think one of the themes that's popping up is for the purpose of you maintaining your safety, you're very good at building relationships. And I know this to be true of you today, obviously, and that's been, like, very impactful in your career, and I think it's a big reason why you have been able to do what you've done in the startup world, but even from the very early days in high school, because I remember you at times, you had friends in high school, even though you weren't in high school all that much. You were kind of navigating these social circles, and I feel like in high school, in prison as well, you have an acute ability to build relationships for myriad reasons, for business reasons, for safety reasons, and I feel like it's interesting the ways that that's kind of advanced you at different parts of your life.
It does help to know people, that is for sure,
Yeah.
because you can't run a business like drug dealing after a certain level without people, without
Mhm.
soldiers. You need a variety of people on your team really to
Yeah.
make sure that your product is getting into the hands of customers without a lot of loss. It's kind of like loss prevention in retail a little bit. So yeah, 100%. And that helped me in a variety of settings. I think there's a couple of themes and they almost run a little bit counter to each other in some ways. One is always seemingly I always seem to find myself back to square one, just me alone in a weird place and a weird situation that I
Mm.
had to figure out and navigate on my own.
Yeah.
That happened so many times. And even to this day, because I was locked up in mental health facilities as an adult several times, those experiences every single time, it's just my first thought. And believe me, adult mental health facilities way crazier than kids' mental health facilities. Adults aren't beating you up as a child like the guards were doing at these juvenile facilities, but the level of mental health issues that you run into with your fellow patients are just absolutely through the roof. You're absolutely running into everything you can possibly think of. So, there'll be a guy screaming at the top of his lungs, banging holes in the walls at 2 a.m. And every time the only thing I can think is, here I am again. I belong in just some weird facility back to being alone by myself, fending for myself. So this is like a feeling that I've had so many times. It is a common theme throughout my life. But secondly, and maybe kind of on the brighter side, also, one is relying on yourself, and that's the only thing you have. And then the other is relying on other people and those relationships that you've built helping you through some of these pretty rough times because even in the juvenile facilities, I would at some point start making friends with some of the other kids. And because a lot of them are just like doing drugs or selling drugs or being violent like me or suicide attempts just like me. And, so there's a flip side of that coin as well.
Yeah. I definitely, as someone who's worked with you, I see both of those. You can operate fiercely independently. And it's so funny to kind of hold that space, have those 2 things be true at once, because you do thrive working independently, but you absolutely thrive meeting people. Like, when people meet you, you build connections and you build deep connections with them, and you're a very engaging person with them. But I can completely understand why you have the ability to be both, particularly because you have, I mean, even from, again, infancy, you found yourself completely alone. So being able to kind of operate completely alone, I mean, most people don't build those capabilities in their life. Very few people are ever completely alone. And I mean, this is me speaking from a place of privilege, actually. So a lot of us who are very well resourced, have a very sound family support structure, things like that, we generally always have someone we can turn to, whether it be family, friends, colleagues, and that's definitely my privilege showing. That is not absolutely generalizable to everybody. But I think for those of us who do come from a place like where I come from, it's hard to think about a time in my life where I didn't have anybody I could turn to. And this kind of speaks to your leaving prison. I know you went back into some mental health facilities as an adult, but you shared with me once the story of when you left prison. If you could speak to that a little bit, I think it kind of carries through that theme of, like, who was there? Who was there for you when you left prison?
Yeah, not my family. In fact, no one except for a friend that I had made inside. He was the only person as the gates opened, like a movie, basically.
Mhm.
he's there sitting there with a cigarette in his hand. And I actually couldn't believe he was. I didn't believe that connections you made in a place like that really carried forward. You say a lot of things like, yeah, we have to go do this and that when we're out, but
Mhm.
it just doesn't feel real because it feels like a totally different world. But there he was as the gates opened, kind of slowly in this legitimately like cinematic sort of scene. There he was, and I really wanted to walk. It feels great. That's a feeling that I try not to forget. Feeling of freedom. It's easy to forget how valuable it is, until you lose it, of course. Yeah, it's a great, great feeling to have it, and I just wanted to walk, so we just kinda strolled. You're absolutely right, no matter how many times I feel like I end up by myself again, and that's just where I belong, relationships are always the things that carry me through.
Thank you for listening to the Marginal Podcast. This podcast is brought to you by the team at Rev Science with theme music by Siddhartha. You can find full episode show notes at marginalpodcast.com and follow us at Marginal Podcast on Instagram. Don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast anywhere podcasts can be found and on YouTube at Marginal Podcast. Thank you so much, and we'll catch you next time.